Welcome to this Facebook Live session. We are here at the Palais des Nations in Geneva for the International Labour Conference. The International Labour Conference is a kind of World Parliament of Labour, and one of the tasks of this conference is to adopt international labour standards. We have been doing so since 1919, and soon we are going to have our 100th anniversary in 2019, and I think that's a good idea to reflect about these international labour standards and the important role they play as a benchmark for social justice in a rapidly globalizing world. We also think that the respect for these standards will shape a future of work for everybody in the world that leaves no one behind. I have today here as a guest Deepa Rishikesh. She is the head of the Child Labour and Forced Labour Unit in the International Labour Standards Department of the ILO. And let me present myself. My name is Hans von Rohland. I'm the spokesperson of the ILO, and I'm going to host this event. We hope that you will come with many questions, because we have so many conventions. There are more than 189, but even more recommendations, 190.
No, 204,
yeah.
and 6 protocols.
So there should be many questions,
yeah.
and I hope that 20 minutes to half an hour will be enough to deal with all that. But first of all, many of people watching and listening may wonder what international labor standards are. You see, I talked to lawyers in Germany, and they were aware about international standards, about international law. But what are international labor standards?
Right. Right, Hans. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And, well, very simply put, international labor standards are legal instruments drawn up by the ILO's constituents, who are representatives of governments, employers, and workers. And these standards set out basic principles and rights at work, right? So the big difference between ILO standards and other treaties, UN-related treaties, are that these standards are not only drawn up by representatives of governments, but also representatives of employers and workers. These standards can be either conventions, which are legally binding treaties, and they can be ratified by governments. Or these standards can take the shape of recommendations, which serve as non-binding guidelines. And as I mentioned earlier, conventions and recommendations are drawn up by government, employer, and worker representatives every year at the International Labour Conference, of which we are a part of now. And just to add one small detail, the ILO, the tripartite constituents of the ILO, have elaborated 189 conventions since 1999, out of which 8 are known as the 8 fundamental conventions. And these 8 fundamental conventions relate to freedom of association and collective bargaining, the elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor, the elimination of child labor and its worst forms, as well as the elimination of discrimination at the workplace in respect of employment and occupation.
So there's a kind of hierarchy here, or
no.
Are all standards equal?
Well, all standards are equal, of course, but these 8 fundamental conventions are known as the ILO's core standards or human rights conventions. They are known as enabling conventions. So if member states, if they can apply these conventions well, they will then be able to implement the other conventions better. They are known as enabling conventions, these 8 fundamental conventions, you see. So, and they are naturally more highly ratified than the other conventions, which cover a very vast array of domains, such as labor inspection, occupational safety and health, maritime issues, social security, and the like.
You mentioned the magic word ratification.
Right.
If you look at the number of ratifications, some conventions have been ratified by almost the whole world, and others maybe only by 20 countries.
Yeah.
Does this mean if there are only 20 ratifications or 30, does it mean that the rest of the world does not respect these standards, or is there also an indirect effect you can observe?
Well, no. What we see is that the fundamental conventions and the so-called governance conventions on labor inspection, tripartite consultations, and employment policy are more highly ratified. The OSH conventions are beginning to be more ratified. There are some conventions that are more difficult for certain member states to apply. So they are very technical, such as some of the occupational safety and health conventions, but it does not mean that they are not valid or are not, relevant to the workplace. They're just more difficult, and so it's a question of timing. Some member states take more time than others, but that being said, it is true that some conventions are ratified much more rapidly. Take the example of Convention 182 on the worst forms of child labor. It was adopted, I may not have mentioned this, conventions have to be adopted by a majority of, not a majority, a two-thirds majority of member states. Convention 182 was adopted unanimously, which shows a political commitment by member states to eliminate the worst forms of child labor as a matter of urgency. And with India's ratification the next week of Convention number 182, this convention will have been ratified by 181 member states. That is close to universal ratification, since the ILO is 187 member states. So there is obviously a political will by member states to ratify some more than others. And of course, it is true that some of these instruments were adopted a long time ago, 1919, and are considered as outdated. So they are no longer being ratified by ILO member states.
But I think all these standards, they also had very often an indirect impact. You see, even if a country has not ratified, it does not mean that the standard is not respected at all. It can be that 90% is respected, and I think the impact goes much wider than the ratification numbers show. Huh?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some member states who do not like. Let's take the example of the U.S. It has not ratified many conventions, but that does not mean to say that it is not applying them in practice. You see, so it's a question of also the political process back home. Whether the parliament in question, it's easy to get a ratification through or not, right? And for the fundamental conventions, of course, by virtue of being a member state of the ILO, these conventions, the principles and rights set out in the fundamental conventions have to be applied.
And for those who do not respect the standards, we have got the ILO supervisory bodies who deal with complaints. So yes. There's a complaint mechanism. Does this mean that if I am not happy with the ILO as an employer or any other employer, I can come here and with my complaint? Or
well, there are different sorts of complaints. So a complaint that you mentioned is the highest level, but if we start at the very basic level, there is an independent body of experts known as the Committee of Experts, made up of 20 eminent jurists from all parts of the world. They come from different legal cultures and backgrounds, and they assess how these conventions are applied, to what degree they're applied by member states or not, right? And they draw up, let's call them their assessments, their observations in a report. And this is the report. It's huge. There are over 800 observations, right? And these observations, the Committee of Experts, meets annually every December. They're published. And these observations come to the Conference Committee on the Application of Standards every June. So we have a special standing committee. Now, the difference between the committee at the conference in June is that it's tripartite. It's made up of government, employer, and worker representatives. So it's more of a political body, whereas the Committee of Experts that meets in December is a legal body. The Committee of Experts gives an impartial assessment of how the convention is applied. The conference committee picks up 24 of the most serious cases of non-compliance and discusses it. At its conference, it invites government delegates, mostly ministers, to come and explain. Is this assessment by the Committee of Experts correct? Do governments have anything to add about measures they've taken to implement the convention? And so here the social partners also from all over the world bring in their value added, their information. So it's a dialogue that is going on between governments and the various supervisory bodies. And so often what happens is the conference committee asks the governments in question after this discussion at the conference to take steps to remedy the problem, or to remedy the problem through technical assistance of the ILO or through missions by the ILO. And these recommendations of the conference committee then go back to the committee of experts in December, and then the committee of experts assesses, has the government taken further measures? So this is known as a virtuous cycle. You know, the information that flows from the committee of experts to the conference committee, and it can be recommendations in any field, freedom of association, but mostly they are in the fields of freedom of association, elimination of child labor, forced labor, non-discrimination.
I already have a question here from Manlio, which exactly goes in this direction. How can you hold countries responsible for respecting international labor standards? I think it would be a good idea to give a concrete example how the ILO helped a specific country to completely change the situation with a concrete result.
Okay, maybe this would help. Let's take the example of child camel jockeys. So perhaps the audience is aware of this or not. Children from South Asia, boys from South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa used to be the victims of trafficking from these countries to the Gulf, various Gulf states, including Qatar. And then they used to be used as camel jockeys on these huge camels for camel racing. The problem is, while the children were initially a bit older, they started being trafficked at a much younger age, at the ages of 10 and 11. A lot of them encountered injuries during these races, and some of them even were dead, or they were sent back disabled. They were deprived of education, they were deprived of safety and health measures, and most importantly, of course, deprived of education. So the gaps in the implementation of the forced and child labor conventions, the committee of experts, the independent body, drew up this assessment in its report, this huge report, and this assessment went to the Conference Committee on the Application of Standards in the tripartite setting. And what the Conference Committee did is, you have to prohibit this form of camel jockeying for young persons below the age of 18 because it's too dangerous. So this went on for quite some time till the government of, in the specific example of Qatar, asked for ILO technical assistance. So the ILO stepped in. The government also asked a country, the Swiss government, to help it manufacture robots. So robots to replace the children. So the ILO was able to go to Qatar in 2006, actually it was, and it was able to see that the Qataris had built the rugby factory where all sorts of robots were built to replace the children, and they were electronically handled. And I was part of that mission, and I was curious. I went and asked the sheikhs, why would you want robots instead of children? Because they told us this was a national sport and it was very treasured. They said it's very simple. Robots, you don't have to feed them, educate them. If they fall off, they don't get injured. You just send them back to the factory. So then the ILO stepped in along with UNICEF to ensure that the children who were there were repatriated, but back into medical institutions or into education or vocational training, so they did not fall back into the worst forms of child labor. At that time, the ILO considered that Qatar had followed a good practice and encouraged it to patent its robot and sell it to the rest of the countries of the Gulf, which it did, and now the use of children as camel jockeys is completely prohibited in the Gulf region. So that's a concrete example of how the ILO helped some member states to implement the child and forced labor conventions.
Yeah, I think it's also an interesting example which shows the links to the future of work. You see, people are afraid of robotization, and sometimes it does a good job, because if it avoids child labor, I think it's a good thing. You see.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's a very interesting example which can lead our discussion in many directions, and maybe we can get back later to this.
Yeah. Hans. And Hans, absolutely, just to tell the audience also that some of these issues, they take some years. Rome wasn't built in one day, so some of these issues, they're resolved after ongoing dialogue between the governments, social partners, and the supervisory bodies over a number of years. It doesn't disappear in one day, but that dialogue needs to be maintained. Yeah.
I have another question. It's such a long time that we have adopted these standards. It's almost 100 years now, as we said before. How can we keep all these standards up to date?
Okay.
There must be different means to do that, and I think maybe if you can give us one or two examples.
Well, yes, as I mentioned, the ILO has adopted 189 conventions, 204 recommendations, and 6 protocols, some dating back to 1919. And some of these instruments no longer correspond to today's needs. So what does the ILO do? It adopts revising conventions that replace older ones, or protocols which add new provisions to older conventions. So the most recent example is the Protocol of 2014 to the Forced Labor Convention of 1930. This protocol entered into force last year. Now, this Forced Labor Protocol is a legally binding treaty that requires governments to take measures to prevent, protect, and provide compensation to victims of forced labor in all its forms. So now with this protocol of 2014, the international community is equipped to fight the modern scourge of human trafficking. Just to let you know that at this conference there will be 5 ratifications of the protocol, and the number of ratifications have now come to 17, but we predict that this will increase. Similarly, recommendations also provide equally useful guidelines to ILO member states on specific policy issues. And this year, the 106th session of the ILC in June 2016 may revise a recommendation, which is recommendation number 71, on transition from war to peace. And the first discussion at the conference in 2015 clearly established the continued relevance of the purpose of this recommendation in responding to the contemporary challenges arising from numerous crises, conflicts, and disasters, which affect, we know, many countries and significant segments of the population. So we're hoping that this recommendation will be revised, will be adopted, by the conference this year.
Yeah, it simply takes account of a world that has completely changed. In 1944, we had, when this recommendation was adopted for the first time, we had a completely different world. It was industrialized countries, and we are not talking so much about disasters in developing countries and countries emerging from crisis and conflict. Well, we still had it at that time, but the conflicts are very different in the developing countries today.
Right.
So,
exactly.
so you really, it's really a new standard. It has not much, probably, it's not ready yet, but it won't probably have much to do with the old one.
Yeah, it has evolved, and the discussions, of course, of the constituents reflect the changes that have occurred since the 40s, when the recommendation was originally adopted. Yeah.
And it is also linked to a stronger ILO engagement, technical cooperation-wise, that we help countries to create decent jobs after a disaster or after conflict and so on. We have projects. There's more we kind of projects we had not 20 or 30 years ago in countries like Somalia or Afghanistan and so on, or the Philippines after the tsunamis and so on, the storms.
Yeah, we have assisted countries. As you know, or as the audience may know, our largest number of technical cooperation projects were on child labor, but now they're expanding. We have forced labor. We have a lot of projects led by Fundamentals and the Better Work program to improve working conditions in garment factories. We have other technical. I can't go into the details, but what the standards department tries to do, along with the technical cooperation departments, is to try to create synergies. So what the technical cooperation projects are doing on the ground are in line with what the ILO supervisory bodies are recommending. So the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. Okay.
I just have a question here. I think it's very, very interesting. It's about communication, so maybe I should answer it. I don't know.
Yes, perhaps.
From Futima, I was not taught about international labor standards in school. and yet they are important. What are you doing to make ordinary people aware of their role in our working lives?
What is DCOM doing, Hans? No, but I think that even when, and I'm a law student, and when I studied, international labor law was an option. But now, in a growing number of universities, international labor law has become very popular. Labor law was always taught, but not international labor law, and it's taking on a prominent role in many universities, and it has grown as a subject. Well, as to how the message is being spread to ordinary people in their daily working lives, well, we have ILO country offices all over the world. We have regional offices and decent work teams, and I am sure they are also spreading the message about the work they are doing in these countries, you know. And I'm not sure if DCOM has also regional specialists who could be spreading this message.
Yeah, and last but not least, our social partners.
Yes, absolutely.
As we mentioned before, there is no possibility for individual complaints, but any worker can see a trade union, and the trade union can come to the ILO and with such a complaint. Or
absolutely, individuals cannot complain, but a workers' organization or an employees' organization can make a complaint to the ILO, and this will be looked at by the ILO supervisory bodies in respect of a ratified convention. Yeah, absolutely. So that is how workers' interests can be protected. They can just communicate their concerns to their local trade unions. Absolutely.
Mortuza, maybe he's from Bangladesh, because he asks which labor standards are in place to protect garment workers in Bangladesh.
Well, a whole host, and I think the ILO has a Better Work project in Bangladesh, and I think the Better Work project is trying to ensure that the garment factories, they respect at least the 8 fundamental conventions, you know, the right to freedom of association, collective bargaining, elimination of child labor, forced labor, non-discrimination, but also the respect of occupational safety and health instruments. So I think the ILO is doing a lot in Bangladesh.
There's another question from Ines here, and she says she asked about the role of employers and workers organizations, but I think we more or less answered this already.
Well, yes, because where, you know, for example, at the Conference Committee on the Application of Standards, where 24 member states are being asked to indicate how they are implementing the conventions, where the committee of experts found that there were serious compliance gaps. Well, that's where the social partners step in and say, well, yes, we think what the government is doing is correct, or no, more to the point where more information, that there are serious compliance gaps. So they provide another viewpoint, so they are another rich source of information, and they can also not only highlight the issues but bring solutions to the table. So the government is supposed to work with the social partners in addressing the issues of implementation gaps.
And of course they also come in if we update, consolidate, streamline conventions like the Maritime Labour Convention. I think the comparative advantage of the ILO is that we have got the seafarers here on board.
Yeah, and the ship
so
owners.
To say, and the ship owners.
Absolutely.
So for the ship owners, this convention was a level playing field.
Absolutely. And
was to establish, that's maybe you can explain a little bit more, because that's very technical. And for the workers, it's just a Bill of Rights for seafarers.
Exactly.
Isn't it?
And the fact that it consolidates earlier maritime instruments. But what is interesting, and when the MLC was developed, one could see that in fact it was the ship owners and seafarers that took a leading role in the discussions, because sometimes the governments were quite lost, whereas the ship owners and seafarers were on top of the issues. They knew the technical issues, and that is why it is widely felt that ILO conventions have they are more realistic, because they are reflective. The social partners bring on board their socio-economic concerns into the labor standards when they're being drafted. So that is why they felt that they are also more realistic and more reflective of the socio-economic realities on the ground.
Okay. I think it is time to sum up a bit.
Yes.
And You already frightened people with your
The book.
with your book.
The huge
with
book.
Your book.
Over 800 observations. Yeah.
Yeah, and how many pages?
About
So-
600,
so
close to
for-
700.
Yeah. So for those who do not want to read all that, I would propose to look at the rules of the game. That's
Yes,
I think
absolutely.
that's a quick explainer how the system works with concrete examples
Absolutely.
and all you are looking for and where to find help if you have a question and so on. We have got this in English. We have got it in Spanish and in
French.
French and
Yeah.
in many other languages.
Absolutely, Russian,
Russian,
Portuguese,
Arabic,
Arabic, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
So
and it's a non-legal language, Hans, so
it's-
people
yeah,
can
it's
understand it.
even I can understand it.
All right.
So I think maybe I let you sum it up, Deepa. We started with social justice, the future of work, and so on, and maybe just to sum up what the role of standards for the ILO and the future of work initiative we have started for our 100th anniversary.
Well, let me sum it up. International labor standards are the core of the ILO. They are the ILO's comparative advantage, and this is why the ILO's this is what makes the ILO different from other UN agencies, and they can help member states to advance their decent work agenda but they can help member states do this at the same time attain the objective of social justice for all workers on the ground, taking into account the objective of sustaining SMEs. Okay, so it's
we are talking about small and medium-sized enterprises.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's a balance, right? And what has happened is, of course, because standards have because issues have evolved, socioeconomic issues have evolved, and some standards have not. So the older standards need to be abrogated, and new standards will come up to replace them. And in this regard, one of the initiatives to celebrate the ILO centenary is called the Standards Initiative. And the Standards Initiative is a series of measures to help the organization renew and upgrade the body of ILO standards to ensure that there is full tripartite support of its supervisory system. And it is a challenging but welcome debate that has enabled the standard system to adapt to the changing needs and realities of the world of work. So I will just close on saying they're more relevant than ever, and the fact that they're backed by a supervisory system that is unique at the international level and which helps member states to ratify the conventions, to implement the conventions they have ratified, makes it all the more relevant in going on to the 21st century.
Thank you, Deepa, for joining this
You're welcome.
Facebook Live.
Thank you. Thank you, Hans.